You think you know the moment your life shifts. You imagine it comes with fireworks or earthquakes, some grand sign announcing that the ground beneath you is about to give way. But for me, it happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning, in a boardroom that still smelled faintly of the cedarwood polish I used to apply myself 20 years ago. The chairs were the same. The windows still faced the skyline I'd fought tooth and nail to reach. Even the coffee machine in the corner hissed in the same rhythm it had since the day I bought it. Nothing looked different. And yet, everything was about to change. I didn't walk into that room as a broken man. I walked in as the founder of a company that bore my name, my vision, and every sleepless night I'd ever endured. I built it from the ground up, one client at a time, one promise after another. I was the one who closed deals when others were too afraid to pick up the phone. I was the one who mortgaged my house to pay salaries when a recession hit. And I was the one who stayed late enough to hear the city silence between midnight and dawn. So when my daughter, Emma, stood up at the end of the long mahogany table with her carefully rehearsed smile, I didn't expect betrayal. I expected pride. I expected partnership. What I got was a knife hidden behind polished words. She began softly. "Dad, we've been reviewing some of the company's future strategies." I nodded, unaware that the floorboards beneath me were about to split. Her husband, Andrew, straightened his tired gesture he always made before delivering something rehearsed. "And we think it's time to modernize leadership," he added, as if he were speaking about outdated office furniture. I glanced around the room. The board members shifted in their seats, eyes avoiding mine like guilty children. I had sat at this table with most of them for decades. They'd seen me at my strongest. They'd seen me build something from nothing. And now they couldn't even meet my gaze. Emma's voice took on a tone that felt almost rehearsed for a stage. "You've done so much for this company, Dad. But times have changed. Business is evolving." And she hesitated, feigning delicacy. "We believe it's best if Andrew and I take over operations fully. You can step back into a more advisory role." Advisory role. The words echoed in my head like the slow closing of a vault door. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because disbelief is the only sound your soul can make when it's caught off guard. "You're joking," I said, scanning their faces for the punchline. Andrew didn't flinch. "It's what's best for everyone. We're not pushing you out. We're just transitioning." I had built this empire so that my daughter would never have to struggle the way I did. I wanted her to inherit strength, not steal it. I wanted her to lead because she understood the weight of what came before her, not because she'd been handed a signed set of documents. But I said nothing. Not yet. Because the truth is, betrayals don't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes they walk in wearing your last name. When Emma was born, I was 25 and dead broke. My wife, Caroline, and I were living in a cramped apartment above a bakery. The smell of bread woke us every morning at 4:30 a.m. I'd leave before dawn, hustling to construction sites, odd jobs, anything that could keep us afloat. At night, while she slept with Emma cradled on her chest, I would sit at a cheap folding table drafting business plans on the backs of receipts. The company wasn't supposed to be a legacy. It was supposed to be a lifeline. But somewhere between the late nights and the early mornings, I realized I was building something that would outlive me. By the time Emma was 5, we had an office. By 10, we had employees. By 16, she walked through the hallways like she owned the place, and in a way, she did. She was the heartbeat of my ambition. I used to picture her sitting at the head of the table one day, not because she took it from me, but because she earned it. I never imagined that day would come like this. I remember that boardroom vividly. The long table gleaming under the morning sun. The framed certificates lining the walls. The faint smell of Emma's perfume, something floral and calculated. I had built this room to close deals, to forge trust, to mark victories. I didn't know it would become the stage for my quiet dethroning. The lawyer slid the papers across the table. My name, printed in bold, stared back at me like a dare. I should have walked out. I should have flipped the table. But I didn't. I took the pen, and I signed. Slowly, calmly. Because sometimes silence is louder than protest. "Thank you, Dad," Emma said, squeezing my hand. Her touch felt foreign, polite, detached. "You'll always be part of this company's story." I smiled. A small, tight smile. Not because I accepted it, but because I understood something they didn't. They thought this was the end of my story. They were wrong. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline I'd fought to conquer, I stood by my office window with a glass of scotch. The city lights flickered to life like old friends keeping vigil. The documents were signed. My title was shifted. My role reduced. But my memory? Intact. My knowledge of every brick in this building? Unmatched. The taste of betrayal is bitter, but it sharpens the senses. As I watched Emma and Andrew leave in their shiny black SUV, laughing like conquerors, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't the calm of defeat. It was the calm of a storm pulling back before it strikes. Because if they thought the man who built an empire from nothing would quietly fade into the background, they had forgotten who taught them the game in the first place. I didn't lose that day. I learned. And as I turned off the lights in my office for what they believed was the last time, I whispered to the empty room, "You taught me loyalty. I'll teach you memory." The first night after I signed, the house was too quiet. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the baseboards crackle as they settled, the distant whistle of a train pulling through the city like a needle through cloth. I sat at the kitchen table with the same mug I'd been using for 20 years. It had a chipped rim and a faded blue stripe, the kind of ordinary object you stop seeing until it's the only thing left that feels honest. I traced the crack in the ceramic with my thumb and tried to remember the last time Emma and I had laughed in this kitchen. The memory arrived with a scent, as if it had been vacuum sealed and stored behind my ribs. Cinnamon. The whole house had smelled like cinnamon that night because she was 12 and determined to bake snickerdoodles from scratch. The sink had overflowed with bowls, and flour dusted the counter like first snow. She wore my apron, miles too big, tied twice around her small waist. We burned the first tray. We ate them anyway. We laughed until the old clock over the doorway struck midnight. I told her the company would be hers one day if she wanted it. She nodded between mouthfuls and said, "I will earn it." I could still see the little crescent of flour she had left on the tip of her nose. It felt like a message from a vanished country, a stamp from a passport I could no longer use. There were other memories, too, less neat, more jagged. The winter the pipes froze at the first office, and I slept on the floor in my coat to make sure the space heaters wouldn't spark a fire. The time a client defaulted, and I drove 3 hours to his farm to shake his hand and forgive the debt because he had a newborn, and I remembered what it felt like to count the dollars in your wallet before buying milk. The day I signed the lease on the 10th floor, hands trembling, terrified and exhilarated. None of those moments were accompanied by applause. Most were accompanied by that same refrigerator hum, that same quiet house, that same chipped mug. Humiliation has a way of rewiring the senses. The next morning, coffee tasted metallic. The office lobby smelled too sweet, like lilies at a funeral. Every step between the elevator and my new advisory desk thudded inside my chest. People greeted me the way you greet a statue. "Good morning, sir." "How are you, sir?" Respectful, distant, harmless, now that the plaque had been moved. I sat at my new desk, smaller and exposed, near the glass wall where the city spread like a map I could no longer read. On the other side of the floor, Emma's heels clicked a thin metronome along the corridor. She had moved into my old office. The blinds were tilted just enough that I could see silhouettes. Hers. Andrew's. The lawyer's. A new assistant with a high ponytail and a notebook held like a shield. A courier arrived before lunch with a cardboard box. Inside were the artifacts of a life I had apparently finished living. A framed photo of the first team I ever hired. A brass letter opener shaped like a ship. The leather-bound notebook with the elastic strap where I had written the names of our first 50 clients. My nameplate, wrapped in paper as if it were breakable dignity. I unwrapped it, and the letters shone under the fluorescent lights. The weight of it surprised me. I placed it on the edge of the desk and felt like an actor who had been moved off stage but asked to keep wearing the costume. I lasted exactly 13 minutes before I stood and walked to the old office. I knocked. Emma called, "Come in." The room smelled like her perfume and something else I couldn't place. A new candle on the credenza, perhaps. Citrus and ambition. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, equal parts daughter and executive. I looked at the window, where I had once watched storms move across the river like armies. I looked at the bookshelf, reordered. The top shelf, where my wife's photograph used to stand, now held a crystal award from a conference I hadn't attended. I said, "Do you remember the winter the pipes froze at the first office?" Her eyes flickered. "Of course. We had hot chocolate in paper cups. You thought the heaters were magical. You named them dragons." She smiled politely. "That was a long time ago." "Yes. A long time ago, when this was ours." Her expression cooled. "Dad, it is still ours. It is just different." Different is a word people use when they mean diminished, but are too civilized to say it out loud. I nodded as if the word had done its job. I left the room without touching anything. In the elevator, a young employee I didn't recognize pressed the button for me. "I know who you are," he said, excited and nervous, as if speaking to a retired athlete. "My father talks about you. He says you built this place out of stubbornness and coffee." "Stubbornness," I repeated, and felt the words settle in my chest like an anchor. "Coffee, too." He laughed. "I've always wanted to ask. Is it true you mortgaged your house twice to keep payroll during the recession?" "It is true," I said. "Twice. And once in my head a third time, in case it came to that." The doors opened. He stepped out and turned back. "For what it's worth, sir, my dad says you were the kind of boss who would call a worker's mother back when his phone died on shift. He says you remembered birthdays." "I did," I said. "It was easier back then. There were fewer of us to remember." When the doors closed again, I looked at my reflection in the metal. I didn't look like a dethroned king. I looked like a man who had mistaken a paper crown for a real one, and then remembered that he had made the paper himself. I walked out into the street. The city smelled like rain. The sidewalks were a language I still spoke. I passed the diner where Caroline and I used to split a grilled cheese because we couldn't afford 2 meals. I could hear the sizzle from the griddle through the door, and for a moment I was 25 again, promising a future to a woman who believed me because I had no choice but to make it. Weakly, with hands that swallowed mine when we shook. Beatrice, the florist who made the office smell like peonies for a month as repayment for a loan I told her she didn't owe. Carl, the contractor who once drove through the night to deliver a part because he said my word had saved his business. I turned the pages slowly and then faster, and then I began to write. Not names, not numbers, questions. When did a promise become optional? When did inheritance become a weapon? When did my daughter stop remembering the dragons that breathed warmth back into a frozen office. I wrote until the paper stuttered under the nib. The questions did not calm me. They clarified me. The phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. I answered. "Mr. Hale," said a voice. "This is Franklin from Halliday and Moore. We represent Mr. Liu. He asked me to confirm a lunch with you tomorrow at 1. He said it concerns the upcoming shareholders meeting." Mr. Liu had been with me since the second office. He moved slow and thought faster. He wore suits that never quite fit and smiled like he owed me an apology. He also owned 7% of the company. "Lunch works," I said. 1 o'clock. "Excellent," said the voice. "He asked me to tell you to bring your memory." "Bring my memory," I repeated. "Yes, sir. He said you would understand." After I hung up, I walked to the mirror in the hall. I looked at the lines around my eyes and the white at my temples. "Old to understand business," Emma had said. "Too old." I practiced the words out loud. "Too old." I watched my mouth form them, and then I stopped. I was old enough to know which bridges were load-bearing and which were decorative. Old enough to know the difference between a family argument and a strategic mistake. Old enough to have already survived being underestimated by better adversaries than my own son-in-law. I slept well that night, not because the hurt had receded, but because it had settled into its proper chair. In the morning, I tied a tie I hadn't worn in months and polished my shoes like I was preparing to enter a church. On my way out, I picked up the brass letter opener from the box and slipped it into my pocket. A silly habit, a talisman that cut nothing but paper. Still, it had weight. Sometimes weight is what you need to remember you are not a ghost. The restaurant Mr. Liu chose was old and honest, with booths, heavy menus, waiters who had been there long enough to know the regulars by the way they folded their napkins. He was already seated when I arrived, his hands folded like a steeple, his eyes kind. He motioned for me to sit, and then said, "Before the menus opened, you built an ark, and they think they own the rain. That is not how water works." I felt something inside me unlock, a latch I hadn't known I had closed. He gestured for my notebook. "Bring your memory," he said again. "We will need to turn memory into minutes and minutes into votes." I opened the book. The smell of leather rose like a promise. The waiter arrived and set down water with a clink that sounded like a beginning. I felt the world tilt, barely, like a ship leaving the dock. The humiliation had done its work. It had scraped me raw and left only what was necessary. That afternoon, when I returned home, the light fell across the kitchen table at the exact angle it had on the night of the cinnamon cookies. Dust motes drifted like lazy confetti. I rested my hand on the chipped mug and did not think of loss. I thought of structure. I thought of the ledger board under the paint of the house, the way every wall is only as strong as the studs behind it. I had spent a day remembering. Now I would spend a night deciding. Enough. There's a moment in every storm when the wind changes direction. It's subtle, barely a shift at first, but if you've lived long enough, you can feel it in your bones before the trees even start to bend. For me, that moment came at 2:17 in the afternoon, 3 days after the boardroom. Betrayal. I was sitting in my study with a leather notebook open in front of me. The house was wrapped in that kind of stillness that only comes after a blow, fragile, echoing, like the silence inside a church after the last hymn fades. On the desk, beside the notebook, lay the brass letter opener. Its blade caught the light from the window, a thin line of gold across the wood. It wasn't sharp, not really, but it reminded me of something I had forgotten. Tools don't have to be weapons to change history, they just have to be used wisely. That's when it hit me. I wasn't the one who changed. The company hadn't outgrown me. I had been here all along, steady as a beam beneath the floors, while they rearranged the furniture upstairs and convinced themselves they'd built the house. I leaned back in the chair, the leather groaning beneath my weight like an old friend clearing its throat. My eyes traced the shelves across from me. Every book, every photo, every framed newspaper article told the story of a man who refused to quit. And here I was, letting my own daughter rewrite the ending before I'd even put down the pen. No. I closed the notebook slowly, the strap snapping shut with a sound that felt final. The grief had settled. The humiliation had spoken its piece. Now, clarity took the seat at the table. I didn't need to fight like a younger man. I didn't need to shout or beg or throw stones at glass towers. I had built those towers. I knew where the hidden beams were. I knew where the cracks had been patched and where the walls would buckle if you pushed just right. The next day, I went to the office earlier than usual. Not out of habit, but purpose. The sky was a pale gray, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself. I liked it that way. Quiet days are perfect for shifting tectonic plates. When I walked through the lobby, the receptionist blinked at me in surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice unsure if I was a visitor or a relic. "Morning," I replied, adjusting my tie. "Just another advisory day." But I didn't go to my advisory desk. I walked straight to the archives. The archives weren't digital back then, not fully. There were rooms in the sublevel, lined with filing cabinets and old ledgers, the smell of dust and toner thick in the air. My footsteps echoed off the concrete floor. I used to walk these halls when the company was still small enough for every document to matter. And buried in those cabinets was the past they'd forgotten. I opened drawer after drawer, metal sliding on metal with a rasp. Contracts. Old meeting minutes. Stockholder agreements. I found what I was looking for in Cabinet 4B, wrapped in a yellowed folder like a secret waiting for the right hands. The Founders Agreement. Signed by me, by the two original partners who'd retired years ago, and importantly, by Mr. Liu. There it was in black ink. Any structural leadership transition requires the majority approval of founding board members. Emma and Andrew might have taken the title, but they hadn't rewritten the rules. Not yet. I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. At 1 p.m. sharp, I met Mr. Liu for lunch again. He sat with his usual patient posture, the type of man who understood the value of silence. When I laid the Founders Agreement on the table between us, he chuckled softly. "I wondered when you'd remember that," he said, tapping the signature line with his finger. "This clause hasn't been touched in decades." "Exactly," I said. "Which means they probably didn't read it closely." His smile widened. "Then perhaps it's time for a refresher." We talked for over 2 hours. About board dynamics. About quiet alliances. About the difference between public power and private leverage. Mr. Liu was old school, a man who believed that legacy meant something. And in his careful, measured way, he reminded me of what I'd forgotten. I was not powerless. I was underestimated. There's a difference. On my way back to the office, I didn't walk like a dethroned founder. I walked like a man who had found the map in the attic. In the elevator, Andrew stepped in beside me. He smelled faintly of cologne and self-satisfaction. "I didn't expect to see you around this much," he said, giving me a sideways glance. I smiled politely. "I built this place. Old habits die hard." He laughed, adjusting his tie. "Don't worry, we'll make sure your legacy is honored." Legacy. They loved that word. It sounded polite, like a gravestone inscription. "Good," I said softly, looking at the floor numbers tick upward. "Just make sure you read all the fine print. Legacy has a long memory." He frowned slightly, confused by my tone. But before he could respond, the elevator dinged, and the doors opened. That night, I sat in my study with a single lamp on, the rest of the house dark. The brass letter opener lay across the notebook like a sword resting on a shield. For the first time since Emma's betrayal, I wasn't replaying the hurt. I was mapping the path ahead. Step 1 was already in motion: memory. Step 2 would require precision. I would not march into their offices waving contracts like a madman. I would do what builders do: assess the structure quietly, find the weakest beams, and decide exactly where to apply pressure so the building shifts without warning. The breaking point wasn't about rage. It was about resolve. And that night, as the city lights blinked outside like distant beacons, I whispered to the empty room, "You took what I built. Now I'll show you who really holds it together." Strategic revenge doesn't start with fireworks. It starts with a list. That night at my kitchen table, I opened my old leather notebook, the same one that carried the names of the first 50 people who ever believed in me, and on a blank page, I wrote at the top in slow, deliberate letters, restoration. Not revenge, not war, restoration. Because this wasn't about destroying what Emma and Andrew had taken. It was about reclaiming what should never have been stolen. I drew 3 columns beneath the title: people, documents, leverage. Then I started writing names. Mr. Liu was first, of course. He had 7% ownership and, more importantly, memory. Then came Valerie, my former CFO, sharp as broken glass, loyal to the core, and currently on a quiet consulting sabbatical, after Andrew pushed her out 6 months earlier. Next, Matteo, the head of operations, who'd been with me since we ran deliveries out of the back of my old pickup. I knew who understood the foundation because they had poured the concrete with me. The second column was more tedious. It meant nights in the archives, afternoons in the legal office, calls to old accountants, contracts, board minutes, old share structures. I was looking for anything they'd missed when they rushed to modernize leadership. The third column was where the thrill returned: leverage. I didn't mean threats or blackmail. I meant truth, the kind of truth that was inconvenient when spoken aloud in a boardroom. Missteps Andrew had made, alliances Emma assumed were loyal but weren't, legal clauses buried in documents they likely skimmed over. I didn't sleep much that week, but I didn't need to. Clarity is better than caffeine. My first move was quiet. I called Valerie. Still ignoring their calls? I asked when she picked up. "Depends on who's calling," she replied, voice dry and sharp as ever. "If it's Andrew, yes. If it's Emma, I usually let it go to voicemail and then play it for my cat." I laughed. It felt good. "I need you." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "I was wondering when you'd stop licking your wounds." "What's the play?" "Restoration," I said. "Good. Because watching those 2 run your company is like watching toddlers juggle chainsaws." We met the next morning at a cafe off the main street. The kind of place where the tables are too close and the walls are covered with mismatched paintings. Perfect for blending in. I laid out what I'd found: the founder's agreement, the share structure, the forgotten clauses. Her eyes narrowed as she flipped through the copies I'd brought. "They didn't read any of this," she muttered. "Amateurs. They thought sentiment was weakness," I said. She looked up at me and smirked. Sentiment built the fortress they're now living in. Time to remind them of the architect. Step 2 was Matteo. He greeted me with the same bear hug he'd given me since 1998, when he showed up late to his first shift and then worked through the night to make up for it. His loyalty wasn't bought, it was earned in dust and sweat. "I've been waiting for this," he said, slapping my back. "Ever since Andrew told me we were switching suppliers to his college buddy's company. The prices went up. Quality went down. I told him it was a mistake. He told me I was too old school. Old school, I repeated smiling. Seems to be the phrase of the year. We sat in his modest office at the distribution center, surrounded by shelves of invoices and schedules pinned to cork boards. Mateo had something Emma and Andrew didn't: operational reality. They don't understand the flow, he said. They make decisions from spreadsheets, not the floor. Last month alone, they botched 3 major shipments. I fixed it quietly. But the vendors? They're not happy. Would they be willing to talk? I asked. He grinned. For you? They'd sing like a choir. I spent the next 10 days like a ghost moving through the house I built. I wasn't loud. I didn't tip my hand. Meetings over coffee with old allies. Late nights scanning contracts. Quiet lunches with shareholders who had gone silent when Emma took over, not because they supported her, but because they assumed I'd retreated. I hadn't. I'd been listening. And as I listened, patterns emerged. Andrew had overextended financially. He'd made aggressive marketing pushes that drained cash flow, assuming revenue would catch up. Emma, eager to impress the board, had signed off on deals without fully reading the fine print. One of those deals involved a multi-year lease on a new headquarters wing at double the market rate, brokered by one of Andrew's consulting friends. I didn't need to invent their downfall. They'd already built it. All I had to do was shine a light on the cracks. The real turning point came during a board strategy session. I was technically there in an advisory role, sitting at the end of the table like a retired general at a parade. Andrew was mid-presentation, confidently clicking through slides about scaling aggressively and expanding market share. His buzzwords hung in the air like perfume, expensive and empty. Halfway through, I raised my hand. May I ask a question? He hesitated. Of course, he said, with the false graciousness of a man humoring a relic. Slide 14, I said. The expansion lease. I'm curious, was the board consulted before finalizing that contract? Emma stiffened slightly. We discussed it during last quarters. No, I said calmly. We discussed the proposal, not the final contract. And according to Clause 7.4 of the Founders' Agreement, any lease exceeding 5 years requires not just board review, but founding member approval. Silence fell across the room. Andrew's face flushed. That's outdated protocol. Legally binding protocol, I replied, sliding a copy of the agreement across the table. Page 12. Mr. Liu cleared his throat. He's right. Emma's eyes darted across the table. I saw it then, the first hairline fracture in their confidence. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. The silence did the work. After that meeting, I called Valerie. The wind has shifted, I said. She laughed. Then let's raise the sails. Together, we crafted the next phase, a shareholders' meeting that would, by law, require a vote on any structural leadership oversight issues, with the Founders' Agreement as our backbone and the evidence of Andrew's missteps. We had the skeleton of a strategy. I wasn't trying to humiliate them yet. I was positioning the chess pieces, quietly, methodically. Each night, before closing my notebook, I whispered the same phrase: remember the beams. Because when you build something from the ground up, you never forget where the real strength lies. One evening, Emma came by my house unexpectedly. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a mixture of irritation and unease in her eyes. Why are you stirring things up? She asked without preamble. I leaned against the doorframe. Stirring things up? I asked a legal question at a board meeting. That's hardly a coup. You're undermining us, she said. I looked at her for a long moment. I'm reminding you of what you've forgotten. Her jaw tightened. We're trying to move forward, modernize. And you are the reason there's something to modernize in the first place, I finished quietly. She said nothing, just stared at me with that mix of daughter and rival that broke my heart a little each time. "Emma," I said softly, "you were raised in this house. You learned to walk on the floors I laid. I am not your enemy, but I will not let what I built be mismanaged into the ground." She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. She left without saying goodbye. As the door clicked shut, I felt the weight of both fatherhood and strategy settle on my shoulders. But I didn't waver. Because planning justice isn't about striking first. It's about knowing exactly when the structure is ready to shift. And the house was beginning to creak. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived like the slow build of a thunderstorm, heavy air, quiet corridors, and the unspoken sense that something irreversible was about to happen. I woke before dawn, not because of nerves, but because old builders rise early when they know the day will shape the future. I polished my shoes, buttoned a dark suit that had seen mergers, crises, and triumphs, and slipped the brass letter opener into my inner pocket. Not for use, just for weight. The ride to the headquarters was calm. The city was still half asleep, the streets painted with a thin layer of fog. I rolled down the window as I neared the building, letting the cool air wash over me. It smelled faintly of rain and concrete. Familiar, grounding. When I stepped into the lobby, people noticed. Not with fanfare, but with that quiet ripple that moves through a room when something old and immovable enters. Some nodded respectfully. Others avoided eye contact, unsure which way the wind was blowing. I didn't rush. I greeted the receptionist, asked about her mother's health details I hadn't forgotten, and took the elevator up. Each floor felt like a layer of memory, every ding marking another chapter I'd built. When the doors opened on the top floor, I could hear the low murmur of voices in the boardroom. The air was thick with polished ambition and barely hidden tension. Emma stood near the head of the table, her blazer crisp, hair perfectly arranged. Andrew hovered beside her, tapping his pen against a folder like a man trying to disguise nerves as impatience. Mr. Liu was already seated, calm as ever, his notebook open like scripture. Valerie stood at the side with a quiet smile, ready to strike when needed. Mateo sat near the back, arms crossed, the embodiment of silent loyalty. I took my seat not at the far end where they'd placed me months ago, but closer to the center, beside Mr. Liu. I didn't ask permission. I simply sat, and no one dared object. Emma opened the meeting with her usual polished tone. "Thank you, everyone, for being here. As you know, today's session will include updates on the new headquarters expansion and strategic growth plans. Afterward, we'll open the floor for any board matters." She launched into a presentation filled with graphs and marketing projections. Her voice was steady, but beneath it, I sensed the tightness. She knew why we were here. She knew the questions were coming. When she clicked to the slide showing the expansion lease projections, I raised my hand. "Before we continue," I said, my voice clear and deliberate, "I'd like to address the elephant in the room." The expansion lease was signed without proper adherence to Clause 7.4 of the Founders' Agreement. As a result, several financial obligations were incurred without full board approval. I believe the shareholders deserve clarity on this matter before we move forward. The room stilled. Andrew jumped in, voice sharp. "We've already discussed this. It's outdated protocol." "No," Mr. Liu interrupted, his calm voice slicing through Andrew's defensiveness like a scalpel. "It's binding, and it was not followed." Emma straightened. "Dad, this isn't the time." "It's precisely the time," I said. "We're deciding the future of a company built on structure and integrity. When those foundations are ignored, everything above them cracks." Valerie stood then, holding up a folder. "For those unaware, I prepared a summary of the lease terms and how they deviate from board policy. You'll find copies in front of you." Papers rustled like dry leaves in a sudden wind. Emma's polished exterior began to falter. Her eyes darted toward Andrew, who suddenly seemed less like a partner and more like an anchor pulling her down. I leaned forward. This is not an attack. This is accountability. If this company is to grow, it cannot do so on shaky ground. The next agenda item was financial performance. Valerie presented a detailed breakdown, not the rosy projections Andrew loved to showcase, but the raw numbers. Cash flow issues, over-leveraged marketing budgets, vendor dissatisfaction. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Then Matteo spoke. I've run operations for over 2 decades. I know the pulse of this company. The current leadership has ignored on-the-ground realities. We've had shipment failures, mismanaged vendor relations, and a noticeable decline in trust from our long-term partners. His voice carried weight not because it was loud, but because it was real. He didn't need slides. He was the data. Several shareholders exchanged looks. A few whispered to each other. The tide was shifting visibly, tangibly. When it came time for the open board discussion, I stood. Not like a man begging for his place back. Like a man who had built the house and was simply reminding the tenants where the main beam ran. When I started this company, I began, my voice steady. We had no money, no safety net. We had loyalty, grit, and structure. Every contract was read line by line. Every decision was made with the understanding that the walls we built today had to hold tomorrow. I stepped aside because I believed the next generation would honor that structure. Instead, I've watched missteps accumulate like hairline cracks in a dam. Ignored long enough, those cracks don't stay small. I held up the founder's agreement. This document isn't sentimental. It's structural. And structure isn't optional. I paused, letting the silence stretch. I'm calling for a formal vote to reinstate founding board oversight on all strategic leadership decisions. Effective immediately. Gasps. Murmurs. Emma's face went pale. Andrew's pen stopped tapping. Mr. Luce spoke next. Seconded. The motion moved to vote. Hands rose one by one. Some hesitated. Most didn't. When the final count was tallied, the result was clear. The majority sided with me. Emma's breath caught audibly. Andrew's jaw clenched. This is a betrayal, she hissed under her breath. No, I whispered back. This is balance. What followed wasn't shouting or chaos. It was the quiet, decisive sound of power shifting. The motion passed meant that I now held legal and structural authority to review, veto, or redirect major leadership decisions, something Andrew hadn't anticipated when he treated the founder's agreement as a dusty relic. Valerie handed out follow-up. Actions. Mr. Luce scheduled a special session to review the lease debacle, and Matteo organized an operational audit. It was elegant, coordinated. Years of loyalty and structure moving like clockwork. And then came the final blow. One of the minority shareholders, a quiet man from overseas who rarely spoke, raised his hand. Given these revelations, he said in a measured tone, should we consider a vote of confidence in the current executive leadership? The room froze. Emma stammered, this isn't necessary. But the motion had been made and seconded. The vote was swift and brutal. Andrew lost the confidence, vote outright. His recent missteps were too glaring to ignore. Emma's support wavered as shareholders questioned her oversight. The board decided that an interim leadership structure would be reinstated under founding board supervision until further review. In other words, I had taken back the reins without ever needing to raise my voice. After the meeting, Emma confronted me in the hallway. Her eyes were blazing, but behind the anger was something else hurt, confusion, maybe even shame. You planned this, she said. I prepared for this, I replied calmly. There's a difference. You humiliated us. No, I said softly. You did that when you forgot who built the foundation you're standing on. All I did was remind the room where the beams are. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, heels clicking like fading echoes in the hallway. Andrew didn't even look at me. He walked past stiffly, the arrogance drained from his posture, replaced by something quieter. Fear, perhaps. I returned to my study that night. The city was awake again, buzzing with lights and distant traffic. On my desk, the leather notebook lay open, and beside it, the brass letter opener gleamed under the lamplight. Execution wasn't about destroying them. It was about restoring balance. And as I sat there, the storm outside finally broke, rain tapping against the windows like applause from a night. The storm had passed, not with fire and fury, but with a quiet, undeniable shift of a structure settling back into alignment. In the weeks following the shareholders' meeting, the company transformed not overnight, but steadily, like a building being reinforced beam by beam. The interim leadership committee, chaired by the founding board, began addressing the mess Andrew's ambition had created. Deals were renegotiated. The overinflated lease was suspended pending legal review. Vendors who had lost trust returned my calls personally, their voices carrying a relief that mirrored my own. Valerie was reinstated as CFO, her sharp eyes already catching the financial leaks Andrew had ignored. Matteo was given expanded oversight, his practical wisdom finally treated with the respect it deserved. And Mr. Liu, he quietly ensured that every legal door that had been carelessly left ajar was now locked tight. As for Emma and Andrew, the fallout was inevitable. Andrew resigned before the board could vote to remove him entirely. His departure was announced with the usual corporate language, new opportunities, strategic transition. But inside those walls, everyone knew the truth. Emma stayed, not out of defiance, but reflection. She avoided me for days after the meeting, then finally appeared at my house one evening. No blazer, no practice smile, just my daughter standing on the porch like she had when she was 10 and came home after breaking a neighbor's window. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. We sat at the same kitchen table, where cinnamon cookies once burned and promises were made. She stared at the chipped mug between us. "I thought I was ready," she said. "I thought I was honoring what you built by taking it forward. But I didn't see all of it. Not the way you do." I listened. Not as a strategist. As a father. "I wasn't your enemy, Emma," I said gently. "But I couldn't stand by and watch you let someone else dismantle everything." What came next arrived without a headline. No breaking news alert. No congratulatory bouquet in the lobby. It was quieter than that, the kind of change that creeps in like morning light under a door and only later reveals that it has been in the room the whole time. 3 weeks after the vote, a courier delivered a thin envelope to my house. No return address. Just my name in a tidy hand I did not recognize. Inside was a single page torn from a legal pad. It held 2 sentences and a photocopy. "You do not know the whole of Andrew's arrangement. Start with the vendor calls on the West Corridor project." The photocopy was a purchase order with a margin note in Andrew's scrawl. "Push this through. They owe me." I set the paper beside the brass letter opener and let the heat rise and pass. Anger had taught me discipline. Discipline kept me from calling Emma that minute and detonating the truth over the phone. Instead, I brewed coffee, opened the notebook, and wrote a plan. First, Matteo. He confirmed that the West Corridor vendor had been replaced abruptly 6 months earlier. Prices had jumped. Quality had suffered. Someone had insisted on it. He had objected. He had been overruled. Second, Valerie. She cross-checked the incoming invoices and found irregular payment schedules that did not align with delivery milestones. Third, Mr. Liu. He reminded me that the quiet power of a board is not in volume, but in sequence. We would not accuse. We would verify. We would ask questions so simple they cornered the truth. The boardroom felt different the next time I walked in. Not friendlier, truer. Emma met my eyes and held them, not as a daughter daring her father to blink, but as a leader ready to hear what might cost her comfort. When the agenda reached vendor contracts, I asked for clarity with a voice that carried no flame and every match. Could we review the West Corridor vendor shift approval chain? I would like the written approvals and the comparative bid analysis. There was movement at the far end of the table, a rustle of papers that meant someone had rehearsed for a different scene. Emma looked to the operations director, who looked at a folder that looked suspiciously thin. Valerie slid a packet to each board member. She had already done the comparison: original vendor's performance record, new vendor's cost curve, the unexplained variance. Acid is loud. Evidence is louder. We did not say Andrew's name. We did not need to. When the director faltered, Mr. Liu asked if outside influence had been a factor. The answer came in a quiet capitulation of posture. A yes that could not quite speak itself. We voted to unwind the contract, open a formal review, notify counsel, and inform the auditors. There would be consequences. I did not feel victorious. I felt like a man with a broom in an old warehouse, pushing dust toward the loading dock until the concrete could breathe again. That night, Emma came by. No makeup, hair pulled back. The kind of simple cardigan she wore in high school when she studied at the dining table while I worked on bids next to her. She walked the perimeter of the kitchen like the room might move if she stood still too long. Did you know, she asked, about the vendor shift before today? No. Did you suspect? I suspected sloppiness, not corruption. She gripped the back of a chair and let out a breath that shook at the end. I wanted to defend him. I wanted to say we were modernizing, that you were holding us back. All the phrases people use when they are too proud to admit they were fooled. We stood in that small truth together. Pride had its place in a build. It held beams aloft in the imagination until the nails caught up. But pride without inspection was a roof with rot. What do I do now? She asked. You do what we did when a wall bowed in winter. You brace it. You pull the bad boards. You rebuild the section that failed. And you keep a record so the next person knows where the cold came in. She nodded, eyes bright and wet. Then she asked something I did not expect. Will you write it down? Not a complaint. Not a manifesto. A guide. That night I began the Founder's Code on plain paper with a dull pencil that refused to be fancy. It was not a list of slogans for posters. It was a ledger of behavior written as plainly as a carpenter marks studs before cutting. Read every contract, as if your name will be whispered in the dark if it goes wrong. Speak last if you are the loudest title in the room. If a decision improves a graph but reduces trust, the gain is a lie. Do not hire anyone who uses legacy as a synonym for obsolete. Pay vendors on time, and do not pick them for anything other than merit. Put people who know the floor in rooms where numbers are drawn. Do not sign a door you would not walk through yourself. I brought those pages to the next meeting. Emma sat beside me, not at the head, but close enough to reach. We did not vote on the code. We adopted it the way good builders adopt a level, quietly and entirely, with the understanding that it would outlast our individual preferences. The days developed a new rhythm. Mornings with Mateo in the distribution center, where work smells like rubber and effort. Afternoons with Valerie, where numbers laid down their disguises and told us where the money actually went. Evenings with Emma, where strategy stopped being theater and started being carpentry. We moved through rooms that used to make her perform and taught them to make her listen. I took the young employee from the elevator to lunch. His name was Evan. He asked every question like a man who understood the value of admitting what he did not know. I told him about the first warehouse radio with the stubborn volume dial, about the time we delivered product in the back seat of my car because the truck died. He laughed and then did not laugh when he realized those stories were not nostalgia. They were instruction. He asked how to tell the difference between a hard season and a wrong decision. I told him the same test I used on myself. In a hard season, honest people draw closer. In a wrong decision, honest people go quiet. We were steadying. But steadiness and safety are different countries. The letter that arrived in the 4th week made that clear. It was from Andrew's lawyer, written in the kind of language that looks clean until you remember it is not a mirror, only a surface. Claims of wrongful interference, threats of public exposure, a veiled suggestion that he had access to information that might embarrass the company if revealed. Mr. Liu read it once, set it beside his plate, and returned to his soup. He had the calm of a man who had built dams and watched rivers try their best. "We will answer in the proper channel," he said, "and we will file what should have been filed months ago." He tucked the letter back into its envelope as if he were putting away a fly that had landed on a good meal. The legal team prepared a response built on structure, not spite. The vendor irregularities, the breached clauses, the conflict of interest. There is no headline in a well-written brief. There is only consequence. Andrew's threats migrated from menacing to plaintive to silent. He did not return to the building. With the fire contained, we turned to heat. Culture does not rebuild itself because a memo asks politely. It requires rooms, rituals, and reminders. Mateo proposed a wall of firsts in the distribution center. The first invoice, the first employee badge, the first late-night pizza receipt with grease stains that looked like a constellation. He wanted the young ones to see that everything they touch had a date when it did not exist. We hung the frame on a concrete wall that has survived 3 forklift scrapes and 1,000 coffee breaks.